surprised. I've sold to businesses. I've even sold to governments. You would be surprised how many times the secretary is that you are the only salesperson I've ever let into my office. The reason you're here is because you were nice to my secretary. People don't go to that business because of the owner. There was a guy who said he drove 400 miles to get to. Guess how much the most successful salespeople listen? Well, they only talked about 41% and they listened about 57% of the time. So they were just talking to a police officer recently, and he said that over 90% of the people that he takes to jail came from a home where a dad wasn't there.
As an entrepreneur with a global team, one of my biggest challenges was managing international payments. I was stuck with high fees, slow transfers, and endless complications. Whether it was paying my team in the Philippines or buying products from Japan, I tried multiple banks and services like PayPal, but nothing seemed to work. Then I found Wise. The savings have been huge, and transfers that used to take days now happen in hours. It's fast, simple, and has become a vital part of my business strategy. If you're not using Wise for international payments, you're missing out on a game changer. Click on the link in the description to get started with Wise today. Welcome back to Inspired by Success. I'm Linda Vo, and today get ready to meet someone who's turned impact into an art form. Breaking sales records, training top professionals, and even creating a movement to help fathers inspire their children. With a background in psychology and hands-on sales experience, he's developed powerful techniques for getting past gatekeepers and connecting with decision makers. From international stages to family dinners, he's a master at transforming connections into lasting change. With insights featured everywhere from Forbes to Speaker Magazine, he's redefining how we approach influence, not just in the boardroom, but where it matters first, at home. You're about to hear from a true game changer. So let's dive into this conversation with our guest, EksAyn Anderson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. What an honor to be here.
Your journey sounds really interesting. What made you realize influence goes way beyond just business? And tell us why you're so passionate about influence.
Well, the thing is, here's the thing. All of our problems fall into one of three categories. There are things that we have total influence over. There's things that we have some influence over, and there's things we have zero influence over. So let me just talk about that, because I'm going to answer your question, but let me just talk about that for a moment. Things that I have total influence over, back in the old days, I used to drive a little too fast and I used to get speeding tickets. Well, that was something I had total influence over, whether or not I put the pedal to the metal too hard, right? So I could control that. But when you're dealing with people, other people's choices, other people's behaviors, other people's attitudes, in other words, relationships, that's something you have some influence over, but not total influence. So all relationships that we have, whether they're in business, whether they're at home, we have some influence, but not total influence. We don't have total control. But what is it that makes us increase the chances that we can get a positive outcome or move from a no situation to a yes? And I've always been fascinated with that. The last of the three categories are things we have zero influence over. So things like the weather, things like our past, things, the stock market, things like that. We don't have almost zero or very, very little control over that. And in each one of these situations, I think the answer is to change ourselves. I mean, if it's something that has to do with my behavior, I can change me. If it has something to do with somebody else's behavior, I can change my approach. And if it has something to have zero control over, which is the third category, I can change my attitude. But in every single one of those scenarios, the answer comes back to changing me, changing how I do things. And so my question has been, what can I do that will increase the chances that I can positively influence someone for good? And I have been fascinated with that for a long time. Great question.
I like that. But we definitely need influence, especially in business and even relationships, our partners, our children. It does matter when you think about it. And there must be big myths about influence that you see people falling for. What are some of these myths?
Well, some myths are that people have total control. A lot of leaders think that they can just let me tell you a myth. A myth is that people are like machines. And if you just say the right words and if you just do the right things, you can put it in gear and like a car, drive this person to do whatever you want. And that's a myth. The truth is we all have free will. And And so you could do everything perfectly and people could still tell you no. But that being said, Linda, there are research-based things that you can do that greatly increase your chances of people wanting to follow you. I got to tell you this. I know of a car mechanic, and I just got to tell you this. This is a car mechanic who I've known for, oh goodness, it's probably been a decade and a half. And let me tell you how I met this guy. I met him. I had a problem with my car many years ago, and I took it to a different mechanic, and this mechanic told me it would cost me $1,500. But there was something about that interaction that didn't sit well with me. And so I took it to a different mechanic. It happened to be this guy I'm talking about. His name's Mike Steika. And Mike took a look at the car, and he said, I can fix it for $10, $10, 10 US dollars, right? And which was a lot different than 1,500. And I said, okay, I'll give you a shot. And I paid the $10 to fix my car. Well, here's the interesting thing. After taking whenever I had a problem with a car, every once in a while, I would take it to this guy, Mike. And I found out later, many years later, in fact, I looked up his reviews on Google, and I found that he had 75-star reviews. And by the way, I got to tell you, his business is always hopping. Had 75-star reviews. But when you read these reviews, let me quote a few of the reviews to you. They said something like this. They said, Mike is going straight to heaven when he dies. Okay. They said, Google should allow me to give this guy 10 stars. There was a guy who said he drove 400 miles to get to Mike just to get him to repair his car. And I'm thinking, like, who drives 400 miles to take their car to someone? And so you see this mechanic who you may not think has a lot of influence. He has a ton of influence. And there are people who come from all over for years and years because of this guy, Mike. And we can talk about some of the things he did. But one of the base things that
$10, that's too cheap.
It's too cheap. Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. I paid $10, but when I came back, when I had another problem, there was, he, probably the next time was probably somewhere around $500. I don't remember the exact amount, but I've probably spent thousands and thousands of dollars with him over the course of a decade and a half, but it's because I trust him. And because I know that he's just going to tell the truth. And I think everybody, when you look at his 70 reviews, I found that 46 of them had the word honesty, fairness, or trust. He's just a good guy and tells the truth. And because of that, people come from all over. And when you're trying to influence anybody, whether it's in business or at home, if you could just be the kind of person who says it straight and tells the truth, people get it. And I almost want to read some of these reviews for you, but they're amazing. And it's because they trust him.
Wow. Okay. So that's, I think being authentic is, if you want to be a great influence on others, being authentic and being honest, I think that applies, and having integrity as well. But it sounds like he's very clever marketing getting people in the door at a great price and then locking you in for a lifetime customer, which is great in a sense too.
Certainly.
You talk about hidden forces of influence. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, no. Go. Finish it. Oh, because I was going to say, it's another question anyway.
I was just going to say,
continue what you were saying.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. So you talk about hidden forces of influence. Can you share a moment when you discovered one of these unexpected sources of power?
Well, yeah. In fact, the one I was just telling you about is actually a perfect example about it. Let me tell you this. Mike, who's this mechanic that I talked about, he is kind of a hidden force. Let me tell you why. When you look up his Google reviews, there's only one mention of the owner. There's a few other mechanics there that don't always mention positively. And I'll tell you this, people don't go to that business because of the owner. They go because of Mike. And because, number one, they can trust him. But let me tell you something else that he does. And this is and some of the hidden forces that are used there. In life, we have what are called expectations. We expect a certain level of something. But when our reality comes in lower, this distance between what we expect and what we actually get, I call it frustration. Okay. So if you lead somebody to expect something and then their reality comes in lower, they're actually frustrated. There are a lot of people in business that do this. They kind of overpromise, but then underdeliver. And if you want to be good at influencing people, you want to make sure that you don't have this frustration, this distance between the two. And so good business owners are able to deliver. They say, this is what we're going to do, and we deliver. And there's no frustration. But really great influencers, I think, are able to shift these lines. They actually flip the lines so that people's reality becomes better than they expect. And I can talk about that a little bit. We can talk about how that principle has helped me get an appointment with a high-level decision maker in New York and some other things. But let me go back to Mike. Let me just tell you what Mike does. Mike will tell people, hey, it's going to cost you $500. But then when you show up to pay for the car, he might say something like this. He might say something like, I found a coupon on that part, and it's only going to be $430. So he sets the expectation it's going to be $500, but when you come in, it's actually less. And so you're delighted instead of frustrated. When you flip the lines, instead of being frustrated, you're now delighted, right? He'll say something like, I'm going to get it done at 5 o'clock. But then he'll call you up at lunchtime and say, hey, the car's done. What he's doing is he's always under-promising and over-delivering. In other words, let me give you one more example. My wife, sometimes she's frustrated with me because she expects a certain level of something, and sometimes how her reality of me comes in lower, and so she's frustrated. But sometimes I can get it right. Let me tell you a time I got it right, okay? And we can use this same principle in business. I remember one time my wife was telling me how much she missed her parents. And her parents happened to live at the time they lived in San Diego, a couple of states away from where I live. And she said it so many times, and I'm a little bit of a slow learner, but she said it so many times that I finally said, you know what? Maybe this is an opportunity for me to do something nice for my wife. And so I actually called up her parents without her knowing. And I said, hey, I'd like to see if I can find a weekend that would work to send her down to see you. And they told me a weekend. And then I secretly bought a plane ticket for her to go see her parents. And I didn't tell my wife. And it was during the holiday time. And we were actually heading down to see some lights near where I live, because there's some lights during the holidays that sometimes people like to see. And I had bought a plane ticket, and I had my teenage daughter help me pack the bag to make sure that I got everything right in it. And we were driving down she thought we were going to go see the lights with some family members. Well, as we were driving, about 3 miles before we got there, she said the perfect thing. She said, I'm really missing my family right now, my parents. And I said, I think you should go see them. And when we got to this turn, one way where you could go down to see the lights, the other one to go to the airport, I actually turned towards the airport, and she looked at me really fast and she said, oh, you missed the turn. And I said, well, you said you wanted to go see your parents. Let's take you to the airport. And she thought I was just joking. She thought I was just being silly. We pulled up to the airport, and I handed her a bag, and I handed her this boarding pass and gave her the boarding pass and said, go enjoy your parents. And she looked at that boarding pass and she said, is this real? Is this real? She said it about 12 times, and had my younger children in the car. I didn't tell them the way we were doing, because I know they can't keep a secret, but they were getting really excited. And I said, go take a few days with your parents. I'll take the kids for a few days. Have a great time. Now, I got to tell you, Laura, that was one of the best things that ever happened to my marriage. And why was it? It's because her reality was better than she expected. So now she was delighted rather than frustrated, right? And so if we're trying to influence people, the research actually shows that when you surprise somebody and make their reality better than they expect, those positive feelings they have for you go through the roof. And that's what happened with my wife. I think I won't go into detail, but things were good, right, for a long time. So those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. How can you make people's reality better than they expect? And I can give some business examples about that if you'd like. But it's a very important process to figure out, how do we make people's reality better than they expect? And Mike does it. I was able one time to do it with my wife. So
I'm just trying to find ways that we could apply that in business as well. Because me, for example, in business, I'm trying to reach key decision makers to get locations locked in for my business, like because I've got vending machines and I want to try to get locations locked in. That's a real struggle as well. So, I've had a background in sales previously, and it's always finding the right key decision makers as well. But what's one strategy for getting past gatekeepers and making critical connections in the world of reaching key decision makers, especially with business opportunities as well? So do you have any tips for us to share?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Absolutely do. In fact, it's some of the same principles. Let me tell you. Let me tell you how I came across this idea. Many years ago, I had this problem with my bank account. And the problem was, Linda, that I didn't put money in when I should have put money in, and I was in the red. Okay. But we're going to talk about this, how it applies. I went down to this bank and I put the money in like I should have. I was actually kind of embarrassed because I had some overdraft fees. And there was a gentleman there named Jeff, and he was really, really kind, and he waived some of the fees. I put the money in like I should have. And when he was done, I looked at Jeff and I said, "Hey, Jeff, can I get the email to your boss?" And he looked at me kind of funny, like, "Well, why do you want the email to my boss?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to tell him what a great job you did." And by the way he reacted, I could tell he wasn't used to this. So I went home that night and I typed up an email and I said, "Dear Mr. Branch Manager, I had the opportunity of working with Jeff. He was very professional and helpful. I think he deserves a raise and a promotion." And I sent the email to his boss and I copied Jeff on it. And I didn't think anything else about it. Well, here's the interesting thing, Linda. I came back to that bank several days later, maybe a week later or so, and I'm standing in line. And this is back in the days when you had to go to the bank more than you do today. A lot of times we can do most of it from our phone these days, but back then you had to go to the bank. And I'm standing in line, and something happened that had never happened to me before. Somebody came up to me. I was standing. There was probably, let's say, probably around 9 or 10 people in front of me. Somebody came up to me and they said, "Mr. Anderson," which was a little odd because it was in a fairly large city that I was living at the time. They said, "Mr. Anderson." And I was said, "Yes." And they said, "Can I help you with your banking?" And I said, "Well, sure." And he took me from the back of the line and he let me do my bank. He took me over to a desk and let me do my banking in front of everyone else. You would have thought I had $10 million at the bank, which we all know that I didn't. But it happened again and again and again where I'd show up to this bank and they would treat me like a king. Well, why did that happen? I ask that sometimes to people. And a lot of times people say, well, maybe Jeff talked and they all wanted you to write a letter for them too or something. I don't know. But here's the interesting thing. Fast forward several years later, I'm sitting in New York. I'm sitting across from this high-level director in New York. And he looks at me and he says, "You are the only salesperson I've ever let into my office." Now, to be fair, he may have meant about the particular product I was selling, but that's not what he said. He said, "You're the only salesperson I've ever let into my office." And what he said next was really, really interesting. And I won't tell you quite yet what he said next, but I want maybe your audience to think, what did I do to get to be in this high-level director's office in New York? And I'll tell you this, it was almost exactly the same thing I did at the bank. Let me tell you what happened. I sent an email to this guy, and guess what happened? Well, I'll tell you, he ignored me completely. He didn't answer me. He didn't say, "Hey, we're not interested." He just completely ignored me. So I called in several days later to try to talk to this director, and guess who I ran into? Well, I ran into his secretary. So I got on the phone and I said, "Hey, can I speak?" Let's call him Bob. I said, "Can I speak with Bob?" And she said, "He's unavailable." And by the way, that's what they always say. They're always unavailable, right? High-level decision makers are generally unavailable. Then I said to her, I sent an email to him last week, and maybe what I could do is just resend it to him and copy it to you. Would that be okay? And she said, "Sure." And as we started talking, I noticed that she had this, I don't know if you've ever been on the phone and you can almost hear someone smiling. She had this bubbly personality. She was very friendly. She was just kind of smiling and being cheerful, and you could hear it even though you couldn't see it. Right. And as she was saying this, I just mentioned, I said, I'm on the phone all day long, and Really appreciate you being so friendly and courteous and professional. Thank you. And she said, thanks, in her kind of friendly, professional way. And it was sincere. I mean, she genuinely was just a friendly, nice person. And as we were talking, I pulled up the email and she was still on the phone. And I said, you know what? I'm going to resend that. But I'm going to mention that to your boss. Just so thank you. And she goes, oh, thanks, she said. And so I had her on the phone and I typed really fast and I said, dear Bob, I had the opportunity of working with Janice. She was very professional and helpful. I think she's an asset to your team. By the way, I'm going to be in New York on these days. And I sent the email and I copied her on it. So it's going to her boss, Bob, copied Janice on it. And the first line was a sincere compliment about Janice. And I sent the email and I said, hey, I resent that email. Did it come through okay? And she said, let me check. And there was a little pause. She said, yeah, it did. It came through okay. And then she paused again and she goes, hey, thanks for the compliment. And I said, well, it was sincere. I meant it. Thanks for being awesome. And it was a sincere compliment. Well, the conversation ended shortly after that. Well, fast forward, I'm sitting in New York. This guy looks at me and says, you're the only salesperson I've ever let into my office. The next thing he said was, the reason you're here is because you were nice to my secretary. He said, I talk to my secretary more than I talk to my wife, and some of these salespeople don't understand that. You see, when you're the first one to be nice to someone and you do it in an unexpected way, remember we talked about this unexpected thing where so Janice probably answers the phone, I don't know, 100 times in a day or 50 times, 40 times, 20 times, whatever it is. And she has a certain level of expectation. So she assumes maybe she'll run into a pushy salesperson, or maybe she'll run into someone who's kind of rude to her, or maybe she'll run into somebody who's just kind of annoying or whatever. But somehow, and I didn't know I was doing it at the time, but somehow I made her reality better than what she expected. In other words, by the end of the phone call, she had a compliment to her boss telling her she was very professional and courteous and helpful, something that was important to her career. And so her reality was better than she expected, and thus she was delighted instead of frustrated. Do you see what I'm saying? And so how can you, one of the questions we can ask ourselves, and here's the other thing I want you to know. Honey works better than vinegar, okay? It's better to be nice than to try to bully your way through. I've heard some people say, well, if you can't get a decision maker, you should be kind of a little bit like a bully and say, now, who are you and what is your title? And try to act like you're the big stuff and they're the big stuff and you got it. The secretary is just a bump on the road. Well, that's against the entire treat people like you want to be treated. And in the long run, it backfires. In the short run, it might work a little bit, but I'm telling you, I would never do that on the phone. I would treat everyone I meet like gold, like royalty, because that's truthfully what we need to do. Right.
I think that I see that a pattern here is just thinking outside, like differently. For me, I'm trying to, like in that example, I've got this vendor that I've been trying to call. I try to call every day. He does not answer the phone. And I just don't know how to get through to him because he just doesn't answer. And I try to leave messages. Now I'm trying to think of ways, like when you talk about that, I was trying to think of ways to be creative, maybe, like find out more information about him, going a bit above and beyond just to doing what the other people in my situation will be doing. So now it's got me thinking as well. But a key pattern is just being super thoughtful as well and being creative in what you can do and just going above and beyond. But do you have any other tips in how I can reach him besides just calling him and messaging him just a sentence or two, maybe? Any suggestions there? If you can't reach anyone.
Well, I talked to one guy who was passionate about this as well. And he actually got a little mug and he put their face on it. He's found their face and put a little mug with it was like a superhero person, like their face put on a mug, and he had a QR code with a video. So it came through to him and the thing would actually notify him when somebody listened to that video. So it was kind of like a video came through and people were so astounded. They put his face on a mug. I thought, well, that was the principle of exceeding expectations better than reality. Most people wouldn't do that and go that far. I know he does that as a business, and we could talk about that. But the principle though is more important than the technique. The principle of how can I And let me tell you this, when you're trying to get through to a decision maker, a lot of times it takes longer than just one call. Okay. What we're trying to do is figure out, we're trying to make a map of the organization. So when I call an organization that I haven't gotten in, one of the first things I do is I'm going to be taking notes of everybody I call and talk to. So if I call in and they say, hi, this is Christina, and I'm noting her name, right? And I'll say, yeah, can I speak with Bob? And she might start talking. She might say something like, well, Bob's out of town. He's at the conference in Memphis or something, and he won't be back till Thursday. Everything she says, I'm noting. And she goes, and I said, well, is there someone else I could speak with? And she might say, well, you might need to speak to Larry, or you might need to speak to Susan, or you might need to speak to Lisa, or whoever it is. And when she starts saying these things, I'm noting it. The reason I'm noting is because I'm trying to figure out as much as I can about this organization. And I know that it might take me a few attempts to get through. Okay. It might take me several attempts. I might be able to get through the first time, and often I can, but sometimes it could take months to get through. And so what I'm doing is I'll note everything that's said. I have a CRM. I like to use a customer relationship thing where I can keep track of everybody that they've said, and I make notes about it. And so when I call back in, I might say, hey, I just wondered, is Bob back from Memphis? And I do you see how I remember that detail? And I'll say, hey, is Bob back from Memphis? Or maybe it's Lisa that I need to talk to. And I'm just saying it as the first name. Here's one of the things you need to remember. When you're doing a sale to an organization, you do not want to be scripted. So if you call in and you say, hi, it sounds like I'm reading a script. And I am reading a script. And because I said I'm reading a script, most people get turned off by that. You have to be really down to earth, not scripted, and just talk to people like they're normal. So it would just be, hey, Laura, I don't know, is Jim in, or did Bill get back from Memphis yet? I just needed to see if you had a minute or two. And do you see how it's okay that I'm stumbling over my words, and I kind of stopped and stumbled a little bit. That's okay. And it's actually good, because I'm now human and not just like, hi, this is my name and I'm reading from a script. And I sound like I'm reading from a script. And so, I'm a salesperson and you don't want to talk to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so
exactly.
The more notes you take, the more you can just be casual and be like, I don't know if Lisa or Bob's in, but one or the other, if I could speak to them. And when you talk really low key like that, your chances of getting through, when you're just confident but low key, first names, I generally don't lose last names. I'll say, is Bill in, or is Susan in, is Bob in? That's helpful. And then you're making a map. Here's the next thing. I generally start higher than I think I need. So if let's say I think I want to talk to a director, a lot of times I'll still start with the CEO. Okay. And let me tell you why. If I send an email to the CEO, and a lot of times it will, if you're in sales, a lot of times you'll get ignored because they get 200 emails a day, But if you call into the secretary and you treat her right, kind of like we were talking about before, a lot of times that secretary will be nice. If you do something nice, like maybe you do find something you could sincerely compliment her on. And she'll say, you know what, the CEO is not the person you need to talk to. You need to talk to, say, the HR person, or maybe the director of technology, or maybe it's somebody else in the organization. And a lot of times if you've been kind and you're the first one who've been nice, and you say, would you mind just forwarding that email to him, copying me on it, and to be frank with you, a lot of times they'll do it. Well, that email coming from an internal source is way more powerful than coming from an external source, because they don't know you yet. Do you see what I'm saying? And so when you start higher than you think you need, a lot of times that email, I call it jujitsu email, can get passed around down to somebody else who can help you. Does that make sense? And so I like to start harder than you think you need. Want to make sure that we're being as kind as we can, but sincere. Like, don't compliment someone if they don't deserve it. But if you can find something that's legitimate and real, compliment them, and you might even compliment them to their boss or whoever. And then take really copious notes, because when you call back in, it's so much easier when you almost when you know names, right? And you can remember details, and like, yeah, I don't know if Bob's back. Like, think about the difference between this approach. Hi, this is so-and-so, and I'm reading a script, and now I'm reading a script, and people, or just saying something casual like, Hey, I called him last week, and I was wondering if Bob had a good time in Memphis, or I wonder if he's back from Memphis even. If he is, I'd love to chat with him for a minute. Or Susan, I heard she might be able to help me as well, as either Bob or Susan. And it's just this really casual, no script, first names kind of thing.
Do you think like your background in psychology has helped you with influence even more? Do you think that helps you see influence differently than most people because you understand people more with the psychology background?
I absolutely do. But let me tell you this, psychology is not as complicated as people make you think. Let me give you one example. One of the premises of psychology is that behaviors are like seeds, okay? And attention is like water. So a behavior is like a seed you would plant in the ground if you're trying to grow something in a garden. And attention is like water. Let me give you an example of how this works in sales and business and even in relationships. So let me give you one non-business example, and then we'll turn it into business. Is that okay? Okay. So have you ever seen a parent, the kid walks in and the parent says, I can't believe you stayed up till 3:00 in the morning and you didn't make your bed and you didn't do your chores and you stayed up too late and you're getting a C- in math. What is that parent doing? Well, they're trying to get rid of behavior, but they're actually going about it the wrong way because remember, behaviors are like seeds and attention is like water. They're actually watering the behaviors that they don't want with attention. And whether they like it or not, they're actually making it more likely that those behaviors occur. Well, how can we apply that to business? Well, I'll tell you right now, even with Janice in New York, she helped me inch the sale forward by letting me resend the email and copy it to her. That was just inching the sale forward. And when she did, she immediately got a positive attention with her boss because I helped connect that. Do you see what I'm saying? Let me give you another example that's really important. A tantruming kid? Have you ever seen kids that tantrum, children that tantrum? Well, I got to tell you, adults in business are just big kids. Okay. So they're the same principle. Let me tell you what happens. Sometimes parents say, my kid is tantruming. And I can't believe they're such a bad kid. But when you actually watch what's happening, you'll see that this same parent who's frustrated is giving their kid a lot of attention every time they tantrum. So the kid's tantruming and the mom's saying, oh, I can't believe you're embarrassing me right here in the store. Do you want a sucker? Do you want an iPad? Do you want my phone? What can I do to make you be quiet? And the kid quickly learns that whenever he tantrums, he can get rewarded with attention and something from mom. The truth is, the best way to get rid of problem behavior, and this applies, and I'm talking about a parenting situation right now, but you use it just the same in sales. Let me just tell you what I mean in an influence, is to focus on good behavior. The best way, I'm going to say it really slow here because this is important. The best way to get rid of problem behavior is to focus on good behavior. So this is what I'm saying. If you have a tantruming kid, number one, when they tantrum, you need to have a conversation with them, first of all, before they tantrum and say, when you act like that, you get zero attention. I'm not going to water. You can just go sit in the corner. Okay. That doesn't mean go send them to their room where they get to play video games because that's rewarding. It doesn't mean go send them, let them read a book or anything. They just have to have zero, completely bored, no attention, sitting in a corner. And what happens is the kid, he might scream for 8 or 10 or even 20, 30 minutes or something, but eventually they'll burn out. And as soon as they burn out and they're calm, if the parent goes up and says, man, I love it when you're calm like this. Now, some parents can't do that. Some parents are like, the kid's sitting there tantruming for 8 minutes and they can't handle it. They're like, oh, my poor baby. And they'll go talk to him. Now, of course, if the kid has something wrong, if the kid is sitting on a tack or something's hurting them, you obviously fix the problem. But I'm saying if they're just screaming for attention, then you would go over there. Now, how does this apply to business? Let's back up just a little bit. If the parent sees that their children are doing something good, a lot of parents say, well, I'm not going to bug them when they're playing nicely. That's exactly the wrong way to do it. When they're playing nicely is when you need to give attention to them. So in other words, when they're playing nicely, that's when you say, hey, I love it when you're sharing with your brother. And I love it that you're putting a lot of work into this math problem. Now, how do you do that in business though? Well, here's the key. In business, whatever behavior you want to see more of, that's the behavior you give attention to. If you're in a negotiation and you're trying to negotiate something, you give attention to what you have in common ground that you can build on, not what you can't. I was talking to a bunch of real estate agents recently, and these real estate agents, they said they had sometimes they'll get lowball offers on property. And some of these agents handle it like this. They'll say, I can't believe you gave me such a lowball offer. I don't even want to show my client that offer. Come back when you can write a big person offer. Well, that's a shaming way to handle it. What's the best way to handle when somebody sends you a lowball offer? Number one, what did you like about the situation that you actually got an offer? And so you say, hey, thank you so much for sending an offer. And then you can build from there. So the principle that I'm trying to say here is anytime you're trying to influence anybody, catch them doing something right and give that behavior attention. And there's more examples I can give about that, but it was a great question.
Do you think this applies? Because I'm curious, and like you mentioned it with the kids and then in business as well. In terms of relationship, like I think having self-awareness and being thoughtful to the other person, like in relationships, for example, being thoughtful to your partner. But do you think that self-awareness plays a huge key in influencing our partners as well to do things that we want? Because, a lot of relationships, there's communication issues, or there could be a lot of I think it's communication is definitely key, but in terms of getting your partner to do something, that you want them to do, which is beneficial for both, then how can we influence them in a way that makes them want to? Because, sometimes with females and like wives and husbands, there's always a naggy one, and then it ends up being contempt and whatever. But like, instead of nagging, how can we influence our partner in a way that makes them want to do what we ask, but in a genuine way
Right.
that they feel like it's not fake, it has to be sincere as well. But like, I think when you said, think of their good parts and what they're doing, how do we do that? How do we apply that in a relationship to make our partners be on the same page with what we want?
This is such a good question. And what I'm about to tell you could apply in business. It could apply in romantic relationships, with children, with anything. Let me tell you one more story, and then I'm going to show you how this applies to what you just asked. There was a kid getting sent to the principal's office all the time. And it was such a big deal that they called in the school counselor. Now, you're wondering what this has to do with romantic relationships. Bear with me. What they did is the school counselor said, well, this kid's getting sent to the principal's office. I'll come down and just watch. And she sat in the back of the classroom, and she observed that this trouble kid was doing a lot of things right, but the teacher was giving the kid zero attention, nothing. So he was listening, he was reading, he was doing some things right, he was obeying instructions, no attention. But as soon as the kid would do something wrong, the teacher would say, oh, there you go again, and she'd write his name on the board. And then he'd do something else wrong and he'd get a check mark. And then he'd do something else wrong, he'd get another check mark. So the teacher's showering all this attention on him for doing what's wrong. And then if he had enough check marks to get marched down to the principal's office. So he's sitting in the principal's office, and they found he was getting doubly reinforced, because this is what happened in the principal's office. The lady who was kind of at the desk there set him down next to this window. And when the bell rang for lunch or a break, his friends would come by and wave at him and be like, hey, and he'd be like, hey. So he's getting a lot of attention from his friends for being kind of the cool bad kid. And so the counselor said, this is completely predictable behavior. Remember, attention is like, behaviors are like seeds and attention's like water. He's getting watered every time he does something bad. And so that behavior is starting to grow and get stronger. So here's my question. If you want to have behavior change anywhere, you've got to catch people doing something right. Let me give you one more example, then we'll go into the romantic relationships. My daughter once, she got up and she knocked on the door. It was early in the morning, and she's just a good girl, but she knocked on the door and she said, surprise, Dad, I got ready for school. I made my lunch. I got dressed. I'm ready to go to school. And I thought, wow, this is a behavior I like. And so I actually went to my wife and said, hey, let's see if this positive reinforcement, this watering behavior with attention actually works. And so I went out and said, hey, look, wow, your bed looks great. You made your lunch. You did all these things. That's wonderful. Thank you. And my wife laid it on pretty thick too. And guess what started happening? She started getting up every morning and started making her bed, making her lunch, all these things without being asked. And now I can't take credit for behavior. I think she's just a good girl, but I'm saying that's shaping. So here's my question for you. And for anyone listening, is there a behavior that you nag about? Like there's a behavior that really, really bugs you. And here's my next question. So let's just say the behavior is that your partner leaves their socks out or they leave the toilet seat the wrong way or something, okay? And it's really annoying. My question is, how much attention are you giving it? If you're nagging them every single time they do that behavior, whether you like it or not, from a psychological standpoint, you're making it more likely to happen. So here's my challenge for anybody listening. For that little garden variety behavior, if the behavior is just this naggy, you left the socks out or you didn't put the trash away or whatever, you didn't do something. And it's going to be really hard for people to do this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Never mention it again, ever. Now, combine this with catch them doing something right. In other words, just like the boy who was causing a lot of problems, there was a lot of stuff that the teacher was just overlooking. What are they doing right that you could say, hey, I really appreciate it when you do this. Or I really appreciate it when you do this. Now, it may take a while, especially if they're in a habit of doing it. Okay. But if you're consistent and you don't water that bad behavior with attention and you start giving attention to the good behaviors, after a while in time, you will see the behavior will actually go down. Now, in the short run, it usually goes up because they're like, well, I can get away with it. But when the long run, if you continue it might take a little while, the behavior, there's a good chance. Now, remember, you can do everything right. People can still tell you no. But the chances go way, 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 way up that you'll get a favorable result if you start keying in on the good behavior, not the bad. Does that make sense?
I like that. That's something to. While you were saying that, I was just thinking, you could use it for a lot of things, and it applies to relationships and our kids. Is oftentimes my son, he tries to get my attention in a negative way all the time. It causes fights with his, or my daughter actually, she causes fights with the brother to get attention as well. But I've got to encourage them to, when they do behave and get along, we try to, I say, thank you for not fighting. And, I've got to just think of ways that I could use that and flip that around, which is very interesting as well. So, thank you for that feedback.
And if you remember,
let's talk about
no problem,
modern challenges.
If you remember that kids and adults both, I'm sorry, one last thing I was going to say, and I apologize to cut you off here. Kids and adults both are really craving attention. They're really craving so they'd rather get negative attention than zero attention. So if you can just say, I'm going to try to find ways to give them positive attention, that behavior will start to get bigger. How can you catch them doing something right? And the behavior will grow. Anyway, thanks.
I like that. In terms of modern challenges, a lot of people are working remotely. I have a remote team these days. And ever since COVID, everyone knows most people are going back to the office. But in terms of the entrepreneurs and business owners that have remote teams, what's your take on building genuine influence in a virtual world? Because, it's not the same being face-to-face. But for me, I personally, with my relationships with my team, I'm just genuinely as honest as I can be. And we've never met in person at all, but I feel like they're my family. And I just feel like, just being my true self and sharing, not just the good things, the bad things, what I'm going through as well. That I've built a strong relationship, and they do, and I reward. I tell them how much of a blessing I have. My superstar Jane, she's amazing, and I've got another designer as well, and I always try to let them know that they're a blessing in my life, and I encourage them, and I tell them when they're doing a fantastic job too. So, that's my influence, but I'm doing it from my heart, and they can feel that as well. But in terms of other leaders, when they have remote teams, what's your take on that, and how can they influence them in a virtual world when it's remote work?
So such a good question. Well, let me tell you this. They did some research, and there's been a number of studies. There was one study, and I can't remember who the university that did it, but the study said that leaders actually emerge as they listen. In other words, one of the things that's really, really powerful when you're trying to influence anybody is to seek first to understand them before you try to be understood. And this is an error that a lot of people make in business, happens in relationships, romantic relationships, where you're like, hey, I need to feel understood. But, Stephen Covey wrote this book 20, 30 years ago, and he called it The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I don't know if you've heard of that book or read it. It sold millions of copies. But one of the habits he said, successful people seek first to understand before they try to be understood. They did some research out of Harvard where they watched people who were having a conversation, and then they asked them some questions afterwards. And the questions were something like this: how much did you like the person you were talking to? And how much did you enjoy the conversation? Guess who enjoyed the conversation the most? The person who was talking the most enjoyed the conversation the most. And the person who was asking the most questions is the one who was most liked. Is that interesting? Like the person. So one of the things that you do great on this show is you're always asking questions, which, to be truthful, you're aligning with this principle where I'm sure people really like you, because when you ask people questions, I mean, people like you. And when you listen to them and you let them talk more, they like you. And so that's why I'm having a great time, and you're probably wanting to die because I'm talking too much here. But,
no, I've got a very curious personality, and I always want to learn. So that's why I love this podcast, because I'm very curious, and I always have a lot of questions to ask. So I'm always thinking. But thank you for that compliment. Thank you.
And you're a great host. You're a great hostess. So thank you. One last thing, they did a study about salespeople who were selling to businesses, and they watched how much they talk and how much they listen. Guess how much the most successful salespeople listen? Well, they only talked about 41, 43% of the time, and they listened about 57% of the time. So they were listening more than they were talking, and they were the more successful. The less successful ones were talking more than they were listening.
Yeah, I found that true. When I was in sales, I understand that, because listening, I've seen people in presentations when they just talk. But then when I went to ad tech sales and I saw the consultative approach where you're listening and you're looking for pain points, and that's where your problem solution comes into place. And that's where there was more success there, because it's more a listening consultative approach instead of just pitching your product, So yeah, I like that principle.
That's right.
What about social media, though?
Where you're truly listening gives you a huge more boost in influence.
What about in social media, though? Do you know how, in terms of how we connect, what principle of influences still work regardless of the platform? Because if we want to build our brand and we want to be a thought leader, especially on social media, how can we influence people in a way that would still work to benefit our audience?
Well, this is a great question. Let me demonstrate. Let me demonstrate right now. If I were in this room with you and I asked you, do you think parents have a huge effect on their kids? I've asked that question, and when I ask that question in a live audience, a lot of times almost everybody raises their hand. Most of the time, everybody raises their hand. I'm going to tell you a story. When I was young, Laura, I used to like to draw trees, and I would draw them with every leaf and every branch, and even the veins in the leaves. Later, I went to school and saw how the other children drew trees, and they drew 2 lines with a poofy cloud on top. And when I went to school and saw how the other children drew trees, I stopped drawing them the way I used to, and I started drawing them the way the other children did. And I found out later that when my mom saw this, she shed a tear. She cried. She literally cried. And you can imagine why. I mean, I kind of stopped being who I was to try to fit in with these other kids. Well, fast forward few years, I was at a little league game, and there was a few different ways you could play little league. You can either be good and hit the ball, or you can, just hold the bat out and it hits the ball and drops. It's called a bunt. Well, I had one bunt the entire season, but I'm not here to tell you about how bad a baseball player I was. There was something significant after this game. We went home, and my mom complained of a very severe headache, and she was not the type that got headaches. And my dad eventually, Laura, became concerned and decided to take Mom to the hospital. Well, I remember standing there in the front room, giving my mom a hug and telling her that I loved her. And then they drove away. Well, I was a little concerned. I went to my uncle, who happened to be visiting us at the time, and I said, "Is my mom going to die?" And he looked at me and said, "No, your mom's not going to die." And I said, "Do you promise she's not going to die?" And he said, "I promise she's not going to die. She probably just has a migraine." And I wanted to believe him. I went downstairs, I climbed up on my bed and started reading this book. It was a book about squirrels. I still remember it. I waited for them to get back, and they didn't get back. And the next morning, I got off my bed. I was a little bit anxious because I wanted to see my parents, and I went out, and I opened the door to my room, and on the other side of this room was kind of a long family room, and I could see my dad on the other side of this room. And there was something different. My mom was not there. Instead, there was a neighbor and another neighbor and a friend and another friend and another neighbor. It seemed like half the neighborhood was at our house. And as I approached, I could see that my dad had been crying. He had tears on his cheeks. And as I got even closer, he was trying not to cry. And he was not doing a very good job. But through his tears, he said words I'll never forget. He said, "I think our mom is going to leave us." And I started to put two and two together. And I said, Dad, we got to do something. We got to do something. What can we do to help Mom? And so, Laura, what had happened is my mom had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. A blood vessel in her brain had burst. She was now brain dead at the hospital, being kept alive by a life support system. A couple days later,
sorry to hear.
we were at the hospital. I could see my mom on this hospital bed. Yeah, she had tubes coming out of her nose. She couldn't breathe on her own. The machine had to breathe for her. And I got to tell you, Laura, they couldn't do anything for her because she was brain dead, and they took her off the machine. And when they did, she kind of crinkled up. She turned bluish as the life left her body. And I remember being really scared. I was 8 years old. I was scared as could be. I wanted to give my mom a kiss, but I didn't dare. So I went and kissed the air and walked out. Well, I got to tell you, Laura, my mom died that day. And as an 8-year-old boy, I watched her die. Here's my question. How do you think I draw trees now? Well, I draw them the way my mom would want me to, the way I see them.
She liked.
Now, my question is, why would I tell you this story? The real reason is I want your viewers to go tell their people they love that they love them. Will you do that? Will you tell the people that you love them, your listeners here, your audience? But the other reason I wanted to tell this story, because you asked a question, I could have just said, hey, parents have a huge effect on their kids. And you would have said, well, that's true. But when I told a story about my mom, do you think you'll remember it more? And it was because of what you talked about being authentic, about being real, about sharing your real heart and telling a story. And people remember stories 22 times more, 2,200% more than they remember just facts. Is that interesting? If I just said, hey, my mom died, or parents have a huge effect on their kids, you wouldn't remember it as much as if you heard the story of my mom dying. And the real reason I told you is because I want people to go home and tell the people that they love them, because life is short. Remember that. But the secondary reason was to demonstrate this principle of being authentic, being real, and being willing to let people see that you're human and you have pain. And when you do that, I think people connect with you. Now, that's my opinion.
Wow, that's a very beautiful story there too. And thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable. It just takes me back when I had a guest and we were talking about the same principle, just like spend as much time with your loved ones and tell them, you love them as well before life is too short. And when we were talking about it, like I couldn't help but cry on the show because my auntie just passed away. And so, it's just being emotional and being real that people connect, especially in this world, this day and age with AI and, a lot of deep fakes happening and a lot of people copying and pasting and not being their genuine self. And you can just really see through that. And I think if you're going to be a brand or an influencer or a thought leader, just be your authentic self. And I think sharing the stories, like you said, that just sets, like, it's more memorable as well. So I think that's very powerful. Now, you talk about stories. Your new book, Hidden Forces, is coming out. What inspired you to write that book? And is there any key points that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. The reason I called it Hidden Forces is because sometimes people think that influence is all at the top. So people say, okay, the CEO has a lot of influence, or the senator has a lot of influence, or the president, or the congressperson, or the political leader, whoever it is, has a lot of influence. But the truth is, my experience has been that influence often lies where you least expect it. So, for example, who got me into this high-level director in New York? It wasn't the director's buddy. It wasn't the CEO or the senator. It was who some people would consider a low-level employee, a secretary. She was the one who had the key to the gate to get me in. She's the one who had the influence. In the business I talked about with Mike, people don't go to that business because the owner, they don't even know who the owner is. They don't go to that business because they have great marketing. They go to that business because of Mike. They go to that business because they know they can trust him. He has more influence than the owner. He has more influence than the big mothership company that maybe they have an umbrella over. And we see this everywhere. I mean, you can even see it in like history. I mean, like think about Gandhi. Gandhi was this man. He literally sewed his own clothes. I mean, he did homespun for clothes. He lived poorly. And he was able to get the most powerful country at the time out of India. He had 2 million people at his funeral. He wasn't the hot shot. He wasn't big up in the government. I mean, he was somebody who was humble, and he was a hidden force. Well, the world in some ways, Laura, is upside down. Just saying, their influence lies where people don't expect it. So let me give you one example more. I was reading online recently, and somebody asked, what is the best example of servant leadership you've ever seen? And this one person on the post said, we were at this party for our company, and one of the executive directors at the end of the party picks up a mop, and he starts mopping the floor, just doing janitorial work. And he said, you know what? I don't think he was doing it for show. He was just doing it because he was a good person. He was willing to be humble. And because he was willing to be a servant, just go mop the floor and do some janitorial work, he said everyone had so much respect for this guy because he wasn't saying, okay, I'm the big, high and mighty person. You see, if you want to have more influence with people, be humble. Be humble enough to listen to them. Be humble enough to see the good in them. Be humble enough to treat everyone you meet like sometimes people want to have hierarchies. They say, well, I'm going to treat the president really nice. I'm going to treat the senator really nice. I'm going to treat the congressman or the political leader or the CEO. And then sometimes they'll ignore people who they don't think are as important. But the problem is let me give you an example. You would be surprised. I've sold to businesses. I've even sold to governments. You would be surprised how many times the secretary is the secretary is the mom of the CEO. That happens more than you would think. Where the mom,
Wait,
the
can you repeat that?
is the mom.
Sorry, can you?
Yeah, let me repeat it. You would be surprised how many times when
Wow.
I've sold to a business, the secretary is the mom of the CEO because he's hired his mom. Do you think if you get in there and you act kind of indignant and like, now, who are you and what is your title, and kind of act like a bully and try to get past her, do you think that's really going to help? The mom of the CEO actually probably has as much influence as you can imagine with that CEO. And so just treating everybody with respect is the key to opening doors. I mean, treat the janitor the same as you treat the president. Treat treat the secretary the same as you treat a senator or a congressperson or a political leader. If you treat everybody with humility, guess what? People start to go, who is that person? And you have more influence. Does that make sense? Well, if you treat everyone, even people who don't have a hierarchy, what I'm saying is instead of being where people say, okay, I'm going to treat the CEO with a lot of respect. I'm going to treat the senator with a lot of respect and the president with a lot of respect, but I'm going to kind of ignore the janitor. I'm going to kind of ignore the secretary. I'm going to kind of ignore people who some people think. Don't do that. That's a form of snobbery. And I'm saying when you treat everyone like they're royalty, and you'll find that doors open more. And it's actually even kind of fun. Let me just give you one more example. My wife and I, we went to this restaurant and we're sitting there. There's this waitress is joking around with us. She's having a lot of fun and we're joking with her. And when she was done, I said, hey, go get your boss over here. Cause I kind of like doing that. And the boss came over and she's standing there and the boss is there. And my wife and I said something like this. I said, you know what? I would drive across town just to come to this restaurant because of this waitress, because she's so awesome. Will you take care of her? And the boss said, thanks for letting me know.
I like that.
Well, the waitress left for a while and she came back later and she had tears in her eyes. She was trying not to cry. And she said, you've been the best table I've ever waited. And I thought that was really interesting because
wow.
It's kind of when you start to try to treat everybody you meet, just as if pretend like they're the president or the CEO or whoever it is, and just treat everyone the same, you'll be interested to see that it's just kind of fun too.
Yeah, it's definitely applies because it's like a universal energy as well. If you give back if you give back great energy into the world to everybody, that energy will come back to you, regardless. Give it without expectations, and I think letting go of the ego is another thing as well. You got to shed that ego, be humble, and have that humility and listen. I think that definitely applies, especially in relationships as well, because I found that out the hard way. Not listening.
I'm losing you just a little bit right here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. It's okay. I'll let it reconnect. It's uploading. Yeah, so listening in a relationship, in all relationships, is really crucial as well. I'm curious to know, in terms of family and legacy, what inspired you to create Dad Fluence, and why do you think it's so crucial right now?
Laura, I'm so glad you asked me this question. Most of the problems that we see in the world today had their root in homes that had real problems. So I was talking to a police officer recently, and he said that over 90% of the people that he takes to jail came from a home where a dad wasn't there. They've actually correlated, there's some studies that have correlated that when dads are present, the children are much less likely to be delinquent or to commit crimes. And right now, I really feel like it's so important for us to go to the root of the problem. Sometimes people think, this politician will save us, or this politician will save us, or this government program will save us, or this government program will save us. But the truth is, what we really need are just good parents who teach their kids good things and teach them to be honest and teach them to be trustworthy and teach them how to build relationships and teach them how to treat people like they want to be treated. And then later on down the road, you don't have the problems. I was watching some of these major problems that are happening on TV. And the truth is a lot of these problems are happening because parents weren't there or checked in a decade or two or three ago. And we need to, they say for every 1,000 there are hacking on the leaves, there's one hacking on the root. The root of the problem is we need good homes. We need good parents. And especially right now, we need dads to step up and to be the wonderful, awesome, influential, brave, strong, good dads that they can be and help and be there for their children.
You say what happens at home matters more than what happens in the boardrooms. Can you share a story that illustrates that?
Can you say that again? I lost the connection. Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
No worries. You say what happens at home matters more than what happens in the boardroom. Can you share a story that illustrates that?
Well, I'll back up to what I just said here. If you see, if watch the news, if you watch the news and see how much contention, how much violence, how much things are happening in the world, where did those problems start? Let me give you an example. I saw somebody, I don't want to throw this person under the bus, so I'm not going to say it because it's not, I want to give them the benefit of that. But I saw somebody that was on the news recently, and they did this major thing that was bad, and they're going to go to jail, and they're going to be in jail for probably 10 to 20 years. And it's going to cost the system millions of dollars to put them in jail, and court fees and attorneys' fees and rehab and counselors. And, if it might cost millions of dollars. Now, the millions of dollars is not the most important piece. The most important piece is the emotional damage, because this person was being violent, okay? And they were doing a lot of things wrong. But I did some research on this particular person, and I found that this person they did not have a dad in their home. And I really feel strongly that if this person had had a dad when they were maybe 6 years old or 8 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old, 15 years old, to just sit down and say, you know what, how do we handle our anger? How do we handle our, when we're not, how do we treat people? How do we treat people with respect? And if they would have had that conversation when they were young, a lot of this problem would have been avoided. There was a wise man who said something like this. He said, if you don't have enough good parents, you'll never have enough prisons. There will never be enough policemen. We need parents to teach people to self-govern, to be able to have respect for people without having to be policed. And when there's no parents there to do it, society starts to break down. And you can see that through history. As the family breaks down, as parenting as that bond becomes less, civilizations erode. And I'm fearful that we're getting to a point where people are worrying so much about other things besides being good parents that the basic things we need are breaking down. So I really feel passionate. If there's any dads listening to this, gosh, you have one of the most influential things. Let me ask you a question here. Do you care what your great-great-grandfather did for a living? Your great-great-grandmother? Do you know? Well, I've asked people this question. Most people don't know. But remember, you had 16 great-great-grandparents. Most people don't even know what they did. Most people are not going to care. My great-great-grandkids aren't really going to care what I did for a living. They're not going to care if I had a really cool car or not. What they are going to care about is what kind of a parent I was, because that can be passed down for generations. It can go down for a long time. And so it's a really, really good question.
That was so incredible what you just said.
So dads, I'll just put it this. Dads what you do as a parent in your own home, in my view, will have more long-lasting effect than anything else you do. In other words, let me just give you an example. Most people don't know what their great-great-grandfathers did. If you ask them, what did your great-great-grandfather or your great-great-grandmother do for a living? Most people, some of them know, some of them can't tell you. But remember, you had 16 of them. And so even if you know one or two, do you know what they all did? And the truth is this, Laura, nobody's going to care. Like our great-great-grandchildren probably aren't going to care what we did for a living. But the kind of parent we are is going to go down for generations. And so I'm on a mission to help inspire parents and dads in particular to realize that they have such a great opportunity. They have, if they really want to make a difference in the world, goodness, go home and love your family. Go learn to be a good dad. Go learn the principles of how you can influence your children for good, because you will save them from a lot of heartache, a lot of pain, and help launch. I mean, literally the choices we make today as parents are going to shape people hundreds of years from now that we never meet. I mean, that's just the truth in ways that we can't even imagine and that are very unseen. It's kind of a hidden force we were talking about. But that's the truth.
It's so powerful. And that's so true. It matters a lot now, even more because of this digital age that we're going into with AI in the digital space, and our kids not being present, our families, sometimes we're not present. And I'm guilty of that too, because sometimes we're busy with work or, our phones and our devices as well. So this is crucial in terms of parenting and having the father that we're present with our kids there too, and shape our kids' shape our kids' future as well. So, ready to revolutionize your content game? Meet Modern IQ, the AI tool that creates SEO optimized, plagiarism free blog posts with just one click. No more writer's block or endless hours of content creation. Generate high quality articles that boost visibility, save time, and slash marketing costs. Whether you're a startup or an established business, this tool is your content team, marketing expert, and SEO guru in one. Click on the link in the description to claim your free article and join forward-thinking entrepreneurs who are working smarter, not harder. The future of effortless marketing is here. Are you ready to dive in? Do you have any book recommendations on influence that have made a huge impact on your career and your family life?
Absolutely. So one of them was The Power of Positive Parenting by Glenn Latham. It sounds like a parenting book. It's also a business book. It will help you in parenting and in business. Another one would be How to Succeed with People. It's an old one by Stephen Covey, How to Succeed with People. It's like this old book, that one of the books he wrote a long time ago. Great book. Those two, I am a huge fan of Stephen Covey, and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a great book. Stephen Covey writes a lot of good, but How to Succeed with People, 7 Habits, and The Power of Positive Parenting, which actually you can use as a parenting book and a business book. Principles are the same.
I like it. I'm going to look into these. Finally, if people want to follow you and connect with you, where can they find you?
Well, they could go a few places. They could look up my Dad Fluence course, which is something I'm passionate about if they're interested in learning how to influence their children for good. It could help moms and dads both, but it's particularly geared towards fathers and stepping up. They could also go to eksinfluence.com. eksinfluence.com is a site of mine, or to my first name, which is eksayn.com. Either one of those would work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And I wish you all the best with the courses and your upcoming book release. So thank you so much for all that wisdom on influence.
Laurie, it's been an honor to be on your show. Thank you so much. You're a wonderful host. And what a great thing you're doing with this podcast. Thank you for allowing me to be on it.
Thank you. Have a good one.